Welcome everyone. We have an interesting topic for you today. We have a lot of videos about how to get into consulting, but we've never talked about freelance consulting. Today we have Lorenzo with us, a senior manager at Strategy and in London. Welcome.
Thank you.
And he also had some experience with working as a freelancer. He also worked with freelancers too. So let's see what he has to say. Let's begin. Let's break it down to the basics. What is freelance consulting? I should share with you that while I was at BCG, I never had the chance to work with a freelancer. We always had full-time employees. But when I joined Kaiser in London, I remember that I worked with a couple of freelancers there. And this was my very first time learning about this occupation to start with. I was pretty much surprised how well that they're earning as well. So we're talking about pre-COVID times, saying, 4 years ago and such. And I remember that they would make roughly 3 times more than I used to make. So that really got me thinking, okay, you know what? It seems like a lucrative opportunity for many people. So do you want to tell me more about why do you think firms need freelancers and what they do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, first of all, you're right. Not every single consultancy will have freelancers or want to use freelancers. Strategy and also doesn't have a reputation for using freelancers, but others obviously do. And I guess the reasons would typically be around making sure that you have a sufficient bench in order to meet your demand during peak times. As you might imagine, there are times during the year where a consulting firm will be busier versus other months. So typically, for example, the summer tends to be a bit quieter. But if you're staffing your internal sort of permanent team in order to be able to just about match the quiet levels, when it then picks up in September, October, for example, you will then therefore need freelancers to make sure you can staff these projects.
During COVID times, there have been a lot of layoffs, and right after COVID, because they couldn't hire that many people, I remember this market boomed for a while.
Yeah, it really thrived, I think, about 2 years ago, because all of the project work that was maybe stopped or didn't happen in 2020 as a result of COVID came back. And through a combination of consultancies either getting rid of some permanent people and not replacing them, and this excess level of demand coming back, that really meant that they really needed to go out there and get freelancers to try and make sure they could deliver.
So we talked about the supply and demand and how it helps us adjust. But also, I think another reason why companies need freelancers is because sometimes they need very specific skills. So especially for smaller firms, say that there's a project that requires Russian or Ukrainian language abilities. And if you don't have any internal resource, then it's understandable that those people may be staffed on those projects. There's always a demand for such specific requirements. Now let's talk about how you can become a freelancer. So in my opinion, you have to work as a consultant first to become a freelancer, right? It's not that common to start your career as a freelancer.
Yeah, typically you'd have a couple of years of experience in a consulting firm, and then you would switch to freelancing.
And how do those people find those consulting companies?
Yeah, so there are a number of platforms and headhunters and recruiting firms, at least here in the UK, that would have essentially teams that look after permanent hires and then teams that look after freelance and interim support. So just to name a few off the top of my head, I know there's about 3 or 4 kind of main ones in the UK. So the likes of Fresh Minds, Dartmouth Partners, the Barton Partnership, Investigo, those would probably be the common ones.
Yeah, I remember actually working with one of those in my projects in London. So what you do as a consultant is that you share your profile requirements, like what kind of language or specific abilities that you would need those people to have, how many years of experience, and maybe most importantly, their time availability, because you need to make sure that they're available during that time. And then they will just send over to you some profiles, and then you would have some small interviews with them to understand they are the right fit. Mm-hmm. And then after you negotiate a price and other aspects, then you staff them on. And in terms of the working model, I remember that I work with some freelancers in person, but also I work with them remotely as well. So what's a common method?
It tends to be remotely. Contractors are often based in other places. Remote work is what works best. But obviously that depends company to company.
Okay. Now let's talk about your experience, because you were at the both sides of the table. You were a consultant working with freelancers, and also you worked as a freelancer for a while as well. Can you tell us a bit about your experience? How did you decide on taking some freelancing roles?
Yeah, happy to. So I actually really enjoyed my time freelancing. So I did it for about 6 months before I joined Strategy And. It was quite a nice way of getting to know more about the freelancing world, which was something that was new to me, but also something that I was quite interested in to try and explore whether a career there was possible. So I ended up working for the same company, actually, freelancing for 6 months, and it was on different projects, which again is not necessarily the most common approach. It tends to be that you work on a specific project, and then when you finish that project, you might be called in to do a different project at a different consulting firm, for example. But in my experience, it was continuous with the same employer, which
Once
was
you
quite
build a
helpful.
relationship with them, right, then you're more likely to be staffed again on maybe another project or the continuation of the same project.
Exactly. I think the way it worked with me was I was almost considered a permanent hire, but in a sense, still having some of the benefits that a freelancer would have.
Did you have the email address of the firm or did you have
I
your
did,
own?
yes.
I'm pretty sure some people didn't even know that you're a freelancer.
Yeah, essentially from the outside world, so from a client perspective, you wouldn't really be able to differentiate whether someone was a freelancer or permanent hire. But yes, I absolutely loved my experience. I think it worked well in terms of allowing me to work remotely, which was one thing that I was exploring at the time. It allowed me to join a company with minimal risk. So sometimes there's always an element of risk when you join a new company because you don't necessarily know whether the work will be interesting for you, whether you will get along with the people, the team. And actually, when you start a project and do a project as a freelancer, it's a nice way to get familiarized with the environment before you commit to a full-time offer.
So technically you can't get fired, can you?
Well, I guess you can. I mean, at the end of the day, they can give you your day's notice or week's notice, and actually it makes it a lot easier to get someone off the project.
So there's still some risks, but more flexible on that end.
Yeah. For me, another kind of risk, which is ultimately why I decided to move to a permanent in-house position, is that you do have to continuously chase for work. Typically, as I was saying, once you finish a project, you then have to go and find another consulting firm to sponsor you for a subsequent project. So there can be unpredictable gaps between one project and the next, which can obviously affect the amount that obviously you earn in a given month or in a given period. And so that was ultimately one factor that for me made it much more worthwhile to be in-house, but others actually quite like that flexibility and they take the time off.
So I understand that this is something that many people do in between jobs, but do you see people also doing this almost like a full-time gig?
I have seen some that treat it as a full-time gig and they're very happy with it and choose to do it. There are sort of two examples that come to mind. There's one person that I've worked with in the past who freelances for 6 months of the year, and then for the remaining 6 months uses that time to travel and go see the world, basically. And there's another person that springs to mind that is someone that does it full time, freelancing that is. And the rationale is they're waiting for the right kind of opportunity to come about. And it's in a sector that's quite niche for a role that is also very niche. And so they're happy to freelance for 3, 4, 5 years whilst they're waiting for that type of opportunity to open up.
What other advantages do you think there are for a freelancer out there?
Yeah, so another big one tends to be that the working hours are slightly better for a freelancer because it's a much more specific type of contract. You tend to find that they work more regular office type hours, 9 to 6, for example, whereas a permanent consultant might be obviously working late if there's a particular deadline.
When I've once worked with a freelancer, it's written in the contract that it's like 9 a.m. until 6 p.m. And I remember one day we really needed her help, but this would mean that she had to work 2 or 3 hours more. She made us pay overtime, which is probably something you can't do in consulting.
Exactly.
And what do you think about the pay? I said earlier in the video that I was struck by how much that they're making, but what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think what you said was right, that actually the pay level, if you think about it on a per day basis, is clearly much higher for a freelancer versus a permanent employee. But one thing you've got to bear in mind is there will be periods that are more quiet where you're not going to be working on a project as a freelancer and therefore not earning any money for that day. It's a bit like being on the bench, but whilst you're a permanent employee, you're still getting your regular pay whilst on the bench. And so you really have to be careful with your utilization levels, essentially. So whilst it might be true that, on paper, you might be earning 2.5, 3 times more, that basically assumes you take no holidays and you work constantly at 100% utilization for the entire year. A much more realistic assumption would be to obviously take some time off. There would be some gaps between one project and the next, as things don't obviously immediately start one after the other. And so it's kind of hard to say what the actual sort of figure might be at the end of the day. but it's certainly a lot lower than that, 2.5, 3 times higher.
Yeah, I definitely see here both sides. So on one hand, it seems like it is less stressful. You're not really bearing the risk of getting fired, at least in my opinion. And also, at least on a day-to-day basis, you're getting paid more. But then it also brings a lot of unpredictability from your end, and you probably can't create a long-term career out of it. Anything else you'd like to add?
I'd say maybe one thing to add is that as a con, it can be quite tricky as a freelancer to go up the ladder in a sense and try and command higher and higher rates. It's certainly possible, but it's hard to justify that once you've had a few years of experience, for example, doing the more analytical things, that you're able to now do the more managerial type of tasks and command a manager rate, for example. The years of experience for the type of freelancer that you're looking to bring in tends to be higher versus a colleague that you're employing permanently.
Fantastic. So today it was an interesting video. We talked about freelancing consulting, and I'm sure you first need to become a consultant to be able to become a freelancer. So please check out our website if you need some more help on it. And we're going to see you in the next video. Take care.